Most people, when they finish beginning Greek, they find their ability to read the New Testament in Greek is actually still pretty stunted. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to get over that so that once you finish beginning Greek, you can actually start reading large sections of text pretty easily. Let's get into it. So if you're at the end of a beginning Greek course and you've finished learning the grammar and you've been working through perhaps some exercises where you have been translating pretty regularly, you might have found that your ability to translate is still pretty slow. This is actually reasonably normal and you're not unusual. However, if you're going through Greek in seminary, this is often where you just get left behind. This is where the seminaries will stop teaching you how to read the New Testament in the original language. You've got all that work done. You've done all the grammar work. You understand how the language works. You've got a good base vocabulary. So what from there? How do you actually go from there to being able to read the New Testament in a pretty reasonable sort of fashion? Well, let's start by learning the vocabulary. And my recommendation here is that you start to learn the vocabulary book by book. Now, I've talked about this in other videos. I'll try and leave a link to one of those up here, but you can watch that and find out more. The way to do this, I think, is to start with the easiest books of the New Testament, like 1 John, and work your way up to the more challenging ones, and get into some of those slightly more challenging things even as you sort of get through 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and so on. I think that getting into Paul's writings even after 3rd John is actually really helpful. So what I've done is I've actually put together the Greek vocab pack, which is designed exactly for this. It gives you all the vocabulary book by book, starting from the easiest books and progressing all the way to the most difficult ones. If you're interested in that, check out bma.to/GVP to find out more. That's not the point of this video though. In this video, I want to tell you very practically how you can actually start doing that. And I'm assuming you've kind of started working through the vocabulary. And for that reason, it's not the vocabulary that's holding you back, nor is it your knowledge of the grammar and the language and how it's working. It's really developing the skills that you need to be able to read the text in a pretty efficient kind of manner. So how do you develop that? Well, there are 3 steps that I normally recommend. And to be fair, you don't even have to do all 3 of these. If you do only one of them, the first one is really all you need. If you want to build on that, the second one will help you do so. And if you really want to take it to the next level, try the 3rd one. Okay, so let's talk about each of these in turn. So if you've learnt Greek and you're ready to start reading, here's my recommendation. First of all, the temptation is when you pick up a text like 1 John and you start reading it, you're going to probably go reasonably slowly. And the temptation is going to be to, once you finish chapter 1, go on to chapter 2, and then from chapter 2, go on to chapter 3. However, this is not really the optimal way of learning to read and really starting to develop those skills. So here's what I recommend instead. Yes, start in 1 John chapter 1. Read through the chapter in its entirety, preferably even in one sitting. So rather than just read 3 verses a day or whatever you normally do, challenge yourself to read a little more. And you can start with 3 verses a day and then the next day reread those 3 verses and add another 3 verses. And then the next day reread those 6 verses and add another 3 verses. But you could equally just read that whole chapter, albeit slowly, and then the next day reread it a second time. The point here is that to really start to develop those skills reading, you want to read and reread the text over and over, preferably 3 times or more per text before you move on to the next text. This is the secret to developing fluency and capacity to be able to quickly identify and understand how words are working in a text. Because remember, you've learned the vocabulary, you know how the grammar is working. All that's necessary is to start to develop those recognition skills that are going to help you move through the text quickly, and nothing is better for that than reading and rereading those texts, and preferably quite a lot of texts in each reading. And I would start with a chapter of 1 John, anyway, it's only 10 verses, 1 John chapter 1, so that's pretty easy. And once you've finished that and you've read that for, let's say, a week, you read it over and over every day, then go on to 1 John chapter 2 and then reread that chapter every day for a week as well. Or perhaps break it in half and reread the first 14 verses every day for a week, and then add the next 14 verses the following week. Whatever you're going to do, the secret is this: read and reread, and again, reread the text. Read repeatedly is the key point here. And by reading repeatedly, what you're going to find is the first time through, you're going to be painstakingly slow. You might even find that even though you've memorized all the vocabulary, you get stuck on some syntactical construction, or perhaps you don't recognize the form of a verb. Well, that's normal. But the second time you read that text, you're probably not going to find that problem. And the third time you read it, you're probably just going to skim right through that piece because you've already looked at that, understood it, and read it a couple of times before that. And of course, the more you read it, the easier it gets and the faster your reading will be of it. So the first time you read 1 John chapter 1, maybe it takes you 30 minutes. The second time you read through, it'll probably take half that time. The third time, it might only take 10 minutes. So take your time, reread the text, and don't rush to move on to the next text. Instead, just continue to work with the text that you've learnt and understood and get better at it and develop those skills in recognizing key elements as you go through that text. So, step 1, read repeatedly. And in case you want another little tip with this, here's another recommendation I have. Once you finish reading through, say, all of 1 John, and you're going to start reading through, say, 2 John, but let's sort of carry on. You do 2 John, you do 3 John, and then maybe you go on to 2 Thessalonians, which is the next book I recommend after the Johannine epistles. Read 2 Thessalonians, which is considerably more challenging than John's epistles. Now, as you're reading through the epistle of 2 Thessalonians, my recommendation would be that you keep reading through and learning to read and reread through 2 Thessalonians, but before you do, just go back to a little bit of 1 John and just reread there, because here's what's going to happen. You get into 1 Thessalonians or 2 Thessalonians or whatever text it is, and you're going to find that that's actually significantly more challenging than what you did back here. So by continuing to read back here, you're reminding yourself that actually I can do this, I did do this, and even though this is challenging now, it's going to become like this text in 1 John as well. So you're able to continue to reread those texts while you're going on with the new texts that are much more difficult. Reread, that's the key to developing skill and reading fluency. And if you only do one thing from this core, this is what you should do. Reread those texts. The second thing to do, let's assume you've been rereading for a little while now and you're wanting to continue to develop your capabilities with fluency and the ability to read. My recommendation would be to read more widely than just the New Testament, or at least just the New Testament text that you're used to. This would be where, while you're doing that reading and that rereading process, you want to take maybe 5 to 10 minutes a day just to sort of jump into another text that is a little more advanced, a little further on, you haven't learned the vocabulary for it, just to sort of look at that text to figure out, can I read this? Can I start to decipher the words that are there and understand it? Now, the task here is not to go through and do that whole read and reread process with those texts. It's really just to expand your exposure to those texts, new syntactical constructions, new styles, new vocabulary as well. Now, again, you're not trying to learn the vocabulary here. This is where you might want to use a reader's editions. And I know I've said don't use reader's editions, but this is where I would recommend using one in conjunction with that rereading process you've also got going on. So grab a reader's edition and start reading through, say, Hebrews or Luke or Matthew or John or something like that you haven't learned the vocabulary for, so that you can start to see new constructions and how the skills and experience you've already gained are actually going to serve you in these other texts. I also recommend that you go on to easy texts in, say, the Apostolic Fathers. Start with something like the Didache, which is pretty straightforward. Or go into the Septuagint and maybe start with Genesis chapter 1 and read the Greek translation of the Old Testament as well. You'll find the more vocabulary you have, the easier these kinds of texts are to actually read. So particularly as your reading develops, your vocabulary grows, I really recommend that you start to branch out outside particularly of the New Testament, but even inside the New Testament as well. Grab a reader's edition and start to work through these. And if you are interested in a reader's edition for the Septuagint or a reader's edition for the Apostolic Fathers, or even the New Testament, I'll leave links to those in the description below. You can go grab your copy of whichever one of those you might happen to want from there. Now, the other thing you can do here is we actually do this inside our Greek Mastery membership. Every month we choose a book. This month we're going through John chapter 11. Next month we're working through the letters of Ignatius. I think it's to the Romans this time. But we just mix it up. Every month month we choose another book and we just sit down together as a group and we read through that text together. It's great fun, lots of experience sort of developing and seeing new texts and sort of getting to read those. And it's a great time just to sort of connect with other people who are reading through Greek texts and learn from one another as well. So if you're interested in that, check out vma.to/get started, and that will give you a bit of an idea as to how you can get into learning to read the New Testament in the original language for yourself. So step 1, read repeatedly. Step 2, read widely. Step 3, and I don't really do this one very much, but this is really helpful as well, is read out loud. Now, I mean with this, read the Greek text out loud, and the goal of this is to really get the auditory processes functioning so that you can start to understand the text without having to turn it into English, if you like, in your head while you're reading. And this is, I think, particularly helpful when you've really nailed the vocabulary for a book, or perhaps even better, the vocabulary more broadly. The place where we find in our membership people get the most value out of this is when they're pretty close to finishing reading the entire Greek New Testament, which means they have a really rich vocabulary, 4,800 to 5,300 words, thereabouts. This is where starting to get those audible kind of prompts and listening to text is really, really helpful. And there's two ways to do this. One, you can read the text out loud for yourself and try to understand it without actually trying to turn it back into English. Secondly, what you can do is actually get an audio book and listen to that. There's YouTube videos you can do this with as well, and just listen to the audio of the Greek being read out to you. And rather than seek to translate it, just see how much you understand. And the more you soak yourself in this, the better your ability to actually understand what you're hearing will get as well. Remember, you've already got the skills. You've already spent years probably reading through Greek texts. You've got a really good handle on the language already, but this is a really good way of just taking your knowledge of the language to the next level. So you're getting to that point where you're hearing the language, you're hearing the text of the New Testament, and you're automatically understanding it. So those are 3 steps that I think can be really helpful for learning to read the original language and getting a better handle on your knowledge of the Greek. If you've got a practice that you've used to help you really understand the New Testament in the original language, leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you there. I'm sure there's something that somebody's come up with that would help with this as well. And if you did get to this part of the video, leave a pizza emoji in the comments as well. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery, because that is ultimately what's going to lead you to the ability to read fluently. I'll see you in the next video.